Since we are covering the prison system in North America, I'm going to give a brief preliminary understanding about correctional facilities. Correctional facilities is basically a term or category that describes both federal and state/provincial prisons, detention centers, etc. We are going to be focusing on the prison system. However, it is important to be aware that our immigrant detention centers also fall under correctional facilities and are tragically very similar to prisons. The prison system of the United States is divided into federal and state prisons. Federal prisons are for individuals who've committed federal crimes. Federal crimes are crimes that are committed in more than one state. This encompasses anything from murders, which transcend state boundaries, and most commonly, tax fraud or money embezzlement. Federal prisons are maintained by the Federal Bureau of Prisons and managed by the FBI and U.S. Marshals. State prisons commonly deal with more serious crimes and longer sentences. How the state prison is maintained and managed is completely dependent on whatever state the prison lies in. In comparison, Canada's prison system is divided by the severity of the sentence. Federal correctional facilities deal with severe sentences of more than 2 years, while provincial corrections deal with sentences of 2 or less years. Security levels. The main levels of security, minimum, medium, and maximum, are similar for both the United States and Canada. When determining security level, the system evaluates safety. Safety for both society, for the correctional staff, and for the convict. Minimum security prisons are for non-violent offenders and have limited security, as in there is no fence segregating them from society. There are no armed supervisors or surveillance technology. However, there is an explicit boundary which has to be respected. Medium security prisons restrict prisoners' movements to a greater extent. There is a fence and gate which segregates them from society. Maximum security prisons, which are a quarter of all prisons in the United States, are generally reserved for violent offenders. Canada additionally has several other groupings: multi-level security, special handling unit, women offenders, Aboriginal inmates, community correctional centers. These all have their own guidelines for the types of security that is mandated. The incarceration process. Incarceration is legally defined as a state of being confined in prison, imprisonment. A simplified version of the incarceration process begins with an investigation which leads to an arrest. Shortly after the adjudication of charges, a trial is then set, leading to sentencing. Sentencing may or may not be appealed, but eventually a consensus is determined, resulting in either freedom or punishment. But how we view the incarceration process and how we view prison depends on who you are, as in, are you the convict or the convictor? I found this intriguing statement from Ed Grabowski. He writes, "As an abstract term, prison is quite simple. It's a place where your freedom, movements, and access to basically everything is restricted, usually as punishment for committing a crime. To an inmate, it's a place where dignity, privacy, and control are given up to guards and prison administrators, where isolation and boredom can drive someone insane, and where the simplest of necessities seems like luxuries." The negative results of incarceration. Incarceration has many negative effects. Incarceration is supposed to serve as a deterrent, something to dissuade the public from committing crimes. However, it does not always prove to be extremely effective. Prison serves to isolate individuals in a harsh environment. This poses many detrimental side effects. Although prison is definitely necessary at times, it comes with risks. The separation of fathers and mothers from their children increase the risk of children ending up in jail themselves. The suicide rate for American prisoners is 5 to 15 times greater than it is for the general American public. Prematurely placing a convict in prison often can further their criminal skills based upon those they come in contact with, such as gangs, etc. John Dewar Gleisner, author of Prison and Slavery, a surprising comparison, wrote, "Incarceration teaches depravity, affects minds adversely, and then releases its damaged products into the free world on their mandatory release date or on parole. Prisons are a warehouse for criminal minds." The prison system is a failure because although it is punishing one for its actions, it is not necessarily providing opportunity for reform. However, I must say that over time the prison system has come a long way, but it is definitely not where it needs to be. The mass incarceration problem. The mass incarceration problem refers to the dramatic increase in imprisonments in the past 40 years. This term is often used by historians and sociologists. Mass incarceration is a major problem, especially in the United States. Michelle Alexander, a legal scholar, deals with this issue particularly in relation to Black Americans in her book, The New Jim Crow, Mass Incarceration in the Age of Colorblindness. Jeffrey Goldberg wrote, "America would not be the world capital of incarceration if it could figure out a way to intervene in the lives of young men before they commit acts of violence, rather than after." The graph below really shows that America is the world capital of incarceration at 698 people per 100,000 population. That is very, very high, and it definitely has the lead, sadly. And Goldberg has a point. He has a point that we need to figure out a way to intervene in the lives before they commit crimes. So find ways to inform the public and reshape the way people think. Statistics from the Canadian Human Rights Commission. 25% of inmates are Indigenous. 10% of inmates in federal prison systems are Black. 36% of women in federal custody are Indigenous. 50% of federal female inmates in solitary confinement are Indigenous. These statistics really grip me, especially when you consider the fact that these minorities hold such high rankings. And I think it really goes to show our ingrained racist approach in our prison system, which really needs to be removed. I found this quote by the Canadian Human Rights Commission that I thought really does show where our prison system needs to be. It comes down to this: every person on Canadian soil, whether they are in our prison system or in our immigration system, deserves to be treated with humanity and dignity, and to have full access to Canada's human rights protection. As Canadians, we need to pride ourselves in creating a prison system that reforms individuals and is able to bring them back into society to be a functioning part of our society. The graph on this is really related to the statistics page that was beforehand, and it looks at population versus incarceration, particularly to the Aboriginal people. So 4% of the percentage of Canadian population identifies as Aboriginal, and 23% of the federally incarcerated inmates are Aboriginal. 36% of women in federal prisons are of Aboriginal descent, and 40% of women in provincial custody are of Aboriginal descent. And this is all from the 4% that make up the population of Canada.
I'm going to be talking about what solitary confinement is, how it's used, and if it works. For the purpose of this presentation, terminology is important. Solitary confinement is a term used in the United States. Segregation is the term used in Canada. And for youth in Canada, it's called secure isolation. All of these processes entail removing a prisoner from the general public to a separate isolated unit where they experience limited human contact and face various levels of deprivation of liberties, programming, and privileges. Solitary confinement is used in 3 instances: pre-trial, when general population would not be safe, and when infractions are committed while imprisoned. Examples of pre-trial are Yusei Paracha, who is a resident of the United States that was charged with providing materials to support terrorists. Paracha was kept in solitary confinement both before and after his indictment. However, he was put in a stricter facility before. This facility had light switches on the outside of the cells, putting them at the guard's control, a broken heating system, and they were not even allowed to have a mirror. There were many shakedowns, and there was no open-air recreation for the unit in which he was kept. After his trial, the restrictions and pressure lessened. Another example of this is Judith Vasquez, also an American. In 1992, she was arrested for murder and held in solitary confinement at the county jail for 3 years. She was in solitary confinement before, during, and after her trial without receiving an explanation or due process. She was supposed to be kept in population. However, the day after her arrest, she was brought by guards to female solitary. When she asked, she was told a judge ordered her to be placed there. She was tried and sentenced in 1995, then moved out of solitary and into state prison. General population would not be safe in the case of gang members and famous convicts, such as killers or rapists. The issue when putting gang members in prison is that some prisons have unequal amounts of different gangs. And so you end up with a prison with a lot of one gang, and if you put another member from a different gang, there will be a fight, which can end up with guards getting injured and people being killed. Infractions that are committed while imprisoned include being insubordinate, attacking another prisoner, and talking back to guards, or attempting to commit suicide. Solitary confinement can be used in both adults and youth cases. Adult offenders can be put in solitary confinement for pretrial, safety, or punishment. Youth can also be put in solitary confinement. However, in Canada, it's called secure isolation. In 9 facilities in Ontario, the majority of youth reported no access to mental stimulation while in secure isolation. Youth in 2 facilities reported having access to some books and magazines. From 2013 to 2014, there was an increased use of secure isolation for youth under the age of 16 years old. In Ontario, youth under the age of 16 years old reported spending 7 hours in secure isolation on average. Youth 16 years and older reported spending an average of 42.7 hours in secure isolation. One issue with this practice is that youth's emotional health can be impacted by isolation, which in turn can interfere with their ability to adapt to the structure of the facility and can affect their effective accommodation to the rehabilitation efforts that are offered. In Canada, the longest term in segregation so far is 6,273 consecutive days, which is roughly 17 years. Correctional Service Canada won't say who the prisoner is or where they are being held, citing privacy concerns. The longest served sentence in solitary confinement in the United States was 43 years, served by Albert Woodfox. Woodfox was originally incarcerated for armed robbery and then placed in solitary confinement after prison officials accused him and another prisoner of killing a prison guard, for which there was no forensic evidence, and the state's principal witness had changed his story of the events to implicate Woodfox and the other inmate, Wallace, only after being threatened with solitary confinement. Released in 2016, Woodfox was 69 when he was released from the Louisiana prison known as Angola. In Canada, the average stay for a prisoner in solitary confinement is 35 days for men, 7 days for women, and 37 days for Aboriginal offenders. Long-term solitary confinement can cause the development of specific psychiatric syndrome characterized by hallucinations, panic attacks, overt paranoia, diminished impulse control, hypersensitivity to external stimuli, and difficulties with thinking, concentration, and memory. A study of short-term solitary confinement done in Canada on the psychological effects of 60 days in segregation was done by studying 60 inmates from various facilities that were either voluntarily or involuntarily placed in segregation for 60 days, and then compared them to 60 inmates from various facilities that stayed in general population for 60 days. Participants began by completing psychological tests and were interviewed to assess their overall mental health and psychological function. The same procedures were completed at 30 and then again at 60 days. Overall, segregated offenders had poor mental health and psychological functioning. However, over the 60-day period, there was no significant deterioration of mental health and psychological function. This shows that long-term solitary confinement causes severe damage, and short-term solitary confinement still causes damage. An example of the effects of long-term solitary confinement can be found in the case study of Ashley Smith. Ashley Smith was in and out of the correctional system from age 15, and also Ashley Smith was first put into segregation at age 15. This was the beginning of a pattern of behavior that consistently ended in segregation. After being transferred to an adult facility at age 18, Ashley was shifted around from facility to facility. This ended when she returned to Grand River Valley Institution for Women in Kitchener. The Fifth Estate reports that at the time, officers removed ligatures from her neck sometimes 6 or 7 times a day. The choking became so severe, facial blood vessels burst, leaving her face permanently discolored. She lost sight in one eye and suffered nosebleeds. 3 days before her death, Ashley asked to go to a psychiatric hospital. She said she would take medication and stop choking herself. There were no beds available. Ashley's body was found early in the morning on October 19th. She had a ligature around her neck. The guards had been told repeatedly not to enter her cell if she was still breathing. Due to the circumstances surrounding Ashley's incarceration history and her death, Correctional Service Canada has created new and ongoing initiatives. One of these initiatives is a full case study on Ashley Smith's experience. There is now a video I would like you to watch. In 3 years, 2011 to 2014, 14 of the 30 suicides that occurred were in segregation cells. Most of them had previously attempted suicide, 7 more than twice. 10 of 14 inmates who committed suicide in segregation were beyond the 15-day mark. 5 had been held in segregation for more than 120 days prior to their deaths. Mental health issues can be known of and unknown of when a prisoner is put into segregation. While in segregation, prisoners have very limited access to mental health services due to the rules requiring them to remain in their cells. Mental health professionals are often unable to fully mitigate the harm associated with isolation. Due to the increase in mental health awareness, the regulations surrounding mental health are a topic of controversy. Overall, solitary confinement cannot answer the question of if it works, because there are too many factors in play. It works as it keeps people separated from general population, but it does not rehabilitate or help people. It does not make someone less likely to reoffend, and it does not save lives.
So I'm going to briefly just touch on the punishments that can be found in the American and Canadian prison system. So first and foremost, the United Nations deemed that solitary confinement over a consecutive period of 15 days was actually a form of torture. And we know through our history that this is not something that is always regulated. Example, Cleef Brader, who's been spoken about in class, Another one Canadian example was Eddie Snowshoe. He's a First Nations man. He spent 162 days in solitary confinement. He would have spent longer had he not chosen to hang himself with a sheet, and this is just in 2010. Moving on from that, prior to 1972, Canadian prisons used corporal punishments, which included lashings, bread water, diets, whippings, and so forth. Due to gangs in prisons, inmates can also receive beatings from other inmates. It's unrelated to the guards and the official punishments. However, depending on the prison, a lot of guards might actually turn a blind eye to this or support it. Basically, these are just due to power gain between inmates. Other official punishments included restricted visitation hours, extended sentences, and removal of good behavior time, otherwise known as good conduct time. This is basically where inmates would receive reduced sentences for good behaviors, and upon the discretion of a guard, these good conduct times could be removed from them. So now I'm going to look at Kingston Pen. I just want to note all the photos of Kingston Pen are shot by myself when I went and visited a couple years ago. So that's why they're not sourced or cited. So moving on, Kingston Pen, it opened in 1835 as a provincial penitentiary for the province of Upper Canada. It was Canada's first federal prison. It predated our confederation. At the beginning, there was 5 inmates. This grew significantly in the first 100 years. Initially, it was an all-ages maximum security prison. It also held women, but by 1934, women were rehoused to different prisons, thus making Kingston Pen a full male offenders prison. One thing to note, the youngest prisoner in the building's history was an 8-year-old boy. He was sentenced for 3 years for his role in the pickpocket operation. However, he wasn't spared any sort of punishments. For about 9 months, he received 49 lashings, breaking rules such as staring, laughing, whistling, even just giggling and idling. I'll speak a little bit on later about that. On the right-hand side is a photo of the dome. It was built to connect all the 4 wings of the prison in 1861. At the bottom, towards the right-hand side, was actually a section of which the guards or the warden would lock them in. It was essentially for their safety, and it was a crucial part needed for them when the riot happened in 1971. It was the 3rd and largest riot Kingston Pen had. The inmates were basically fed up with the conditions and how they were being treated. And so that was a very damaging riot. The riot held 6 hostages, all guards, and it lasted for over 4 days. But moving on from that, original rules stated that the inmates can communicate with other inmates in any other way, otherwise they'd risk lashing punishments. This is exactly what happened to that 8-year-old little boy. Simply for staring at another inmate, he was able to receive these lashings. Typically, those sent to Kingston Pen would remain here until they died. It was also known for the violence during its years running. On the left-hand side is a chart looking at the population. You can see that a lot of the inmates run from 21 to 40 years old. On the right-hand side is another chart, both produced in 2010, by the way, and it is the potential of reintegration. You look first and you see these really high bars, and it's like, wow, there's a lot of good reintegration potentials. But you look at the legend on the right-hand side, and you actually notice that those big yellow bars are actually the low potential reintegration, much smaller for medium potential, and almost non-existent as a high potential all across the age groups. Now, briefly, a notorious inmate from Kingston Pen. Almost everyone has heard of him, Paul Bernardo. He was otherwise known as the Scarborough Rapist. Between May 4th of 1987 and April of 1991, he committed 12 rapes, which didn't include the numerous rape attempts that he also had. In June of 1991, he committed murder of a young girl named Leslie with his partner Carla. They cut up her body and dumped her in a river. She was found the next day, I believe it was. In 1993, we saw his arrest for the rapes and the murders, but it wasn't until September 1st of 1995 that he was actually found guilty of all his charges. These charges included counts of kidnapping, confinement, aggravated sexual assault, first-degree murder, and a count of indignity to a deceased human body. He was sentenced to Kingston Pen with life in prison, no chance of parole for 25 years. He spent 23 hours a day in his cell. 1 hour a day he was allowed out, and when Kingston Pen closed down, he was moved to another maximum security prison in Ontario. I believe it is in Bath, Ontario, that he is currently residing. Now to move on to Louisiana State Penitentiary, otherwise known as Angola Prison. the basics of it, it is the state's oldest prison, America's largest maximum security prison. To get an idea of the size, it is larger than the state of Manhattan, which is the photo on the right-hand side. Typically, it's referred to Angola prison due to the Angolan slaves who once worked in the fields. Another thing to mention, approximately 6,500 inmates are currently there. Most of them are African American, and all the inmates are men. Previous decades saw thousands of assaults, both inmate and guard initiated. There's a 54-year-old tradition, the Angola rodeo, which I personally find is disgusting. Inexperienced inmates are allowed to participate in this rodeo, bearing in mind that they are inexperienced. They have no training whatsoever. The public can purchase tickets for $20. It's held every Sunday in October and a couple in April. And some of the events include sitting at a poker table, the inmates in the ring, and the last person to stand up from their chair would receive like a money. So there's a lot of incentive for them. They wanted the money, but it came at a lot of risks. Risks included broken hips, bones, knees, you name it, up to and including death. So to me, it's just shocking. It's disgusting, honestly. But moving forward, 95% of the inmates will die in Angola. This is a stat from 1997 from a documentary called The Farm. It's called The Farm because there's a lot of labor used on the farms, which is why Angola is able to remain afloat. A lot of their income comes from the farming and the harvesting that the inmates are to do every day. In 2007, about $1.67 was spent per inmate per day for food. So this works out to about 50 cents a meal for each prisoner, which really isn't much. And another thing to note is that rehabilitation reform practices are much better now due to the last warden that was there. So a bit about the shocking history of Angola. This is going to wrap up my part of the presentation. In 2015, there was research from an investigation, a 6-month investigation, that revealed that the prison had substandard conditions and inhumane healthcare. It led to a high death rate. And I want to note something from one of the articles about this. Browner, he was a prisoner at a Dixon Correctional Institution. He got a back injury, so it left him paralyzed from the waist down. He got moved to Louisiana State, and he was classified as an officer as dangerous, despite being unable to walk. He ended up being placed in solitary confinement on a bed, and he didn't have access to a wheelchair, so he was confined to this bed. Within a month, pressure of his own body wore on his skin created bed sores, which became infected. It tunneled through his buttocks and his scrotum, exposed bone, and within a month, it reached his blood, his heart, and he required emergency surgery. So he spent 10 years after that fighting the prison for medical care, and it was really hard for him. Any of the grievances he filed went nowhere. So you can see that a lot of the prisoners really just didn't have any rights. They weren't seen as human. It was really disgusting. Angola is one of the, it was known actually in the 1960s as one of the bloodiest prisons of the South, and this was due to the high inmate assault rates and the neglect of the officers. Going back to 1951, 8 inmates actually cut their Achilles tendon in protest of the conditions there. This protest, although very drastic, didn't do anything for them. The guards actually didn't care. Currently, it's in a state of relative calm compared to the violent history. This is because of the reform, the rehabilitation. Angola now focuses, although they still do the labor, they focus on more religious practice. Doesn't matter the type of religion, but allowing the prisoners to have a sense of religion and find and seek comfort in a god, Buddha, you name it. But that will conclude my section of the presentation, so I hope you enjoyed it.